Okay, well, thank you very much, Joe, and everybody for organising this. This workshop, which I've been really looking forward to. So I wanted to start, as I often do, with an apology. I mean, the apology is that Joe said it would in the invitation that it would be okay if I didn't have any sort of new research to present. And that's the case. I don't have any sort of new research to present. So what I want to do is reflect on, I said, some reflections on post-COVID and the politics of expert advice, but particularly reflections on a piece that I wrote and published quite early on during the pandemic in 2020. And so in my more distant background, I've written a lot about the politics of expertise and the relationship between expertise and democratic politics. And I sort of returned to that at the beginning of the pandemic with a colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, Michael Mackenzie. And we wrote an article advocating advocating diversity and openness about disagreement in the production of expert advice for politics, right? And in a way, our argument about diversity was pretty conventional and pretty widely accepted. Our arguments about the importance of open disagreement we thought were more original and a bit more provocative, because what we wanted to articulate was both the epistemic benefits and, importantly, the political benefits of permitting and perhaps even encouraging and structuring open disagreement among experts. And so we concluded by pretty speculatively suggesting institutional reforms, thinking of practices like, not just practices like publishing minutes, but publishing, perhaps holding votes on expert committees at particular moments or on particular issues. These sorts of practices, perhaps having minority reports. So that's something that Zeynep Pamak, your new colleague,
yeah, she couldn't make it today. I'm sad about that. She's out of town.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that too, because I was looking forward to catching up with her again. But she made a similar kind of argument in the journal Perspectives on Politics, where she also develops the idea of a kind of adversarial structuring of expert advice, and arguing for the importance of, arguing for institutional reforms like issuing minority reports in the way that the US Supreme Court does. And essentially having sort of procedures that enable the public communication of difference, of strength of agreement across experts, and an opportunity for explanation. So what was also, we thought, original about our take on it was that it was explicitly oriented to a kind of to some political goals as well. That there was a sense in which one important challenge that was faced by experts in political context is that their advice is going to be taken up and used strategically. Used strategically by others, it's going to be taken up selectively, it's going to be manipulated, and that, in essence, the two parties don't share interests, right? The experts don't have the same interests as the politicians. They diverge, and they know this, and there's a kind of wariness around this. And so our thought was like, this is an opportunity to think about institutionalizing disagreement in a way that enables maintenance of that boundary between expert advice and political decision. So after we published this, and looking at some of the official and sort of academic responses to COVID since then, have been in a way quite encouraging for us, in a sense. So there's a very nice paper by Hannah Baker and her colleagues, like she traces the evolution of SAGE and its evolution towards greater openness in the sense that they now identify who is on that committee, who's a member of that committee, and they publish after a decent delay, they publish the minutes. Baker, they kind of support this move towards transparency. They support this kind of move, but they say it doesn't go far enough, that there's still great opacity about who actually writes these minutes, who actually constructs these collective statements that are then fed into political decision-making processes. And she also said there's, of course, great opacity about what happens to them behind closed doors, what happens then in that translation. But in a sense, we could say that looks like an encouraging move from the point of view of the kind of argument we were making. Another kind of encouragement, I suppose, comes from some of the reflections of SAGE members themselves. So Susan Michie, along with some other colleagues, has written a piece quite recently in which she argued that government scientific advisors should have, she said she wants three things: more independence, more freedom to criticize politicians who selectively or deceptively deploy scientific advice. So she uses the terms play fast and loose. I read that more strongly as selective and deceptive use of scientific advice. And she says be more transparent, engage with the public more actively. So she's advocating transparency and advocating, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but particularly in that second point about, well, the first 2 points about independence and freedom to criticize politicians who selectively or who play fast and loose with scientific advice, there's a pretty strong appeal to this political dimension, to this sense that there is a struggle and that one of the difficulties experts face is managing the fact that they know that their claims are going to be selectively taken up and interpreted and used, and they have to orient to that, and they have to react defensively, and then that has to be part of how they see their role. So the Science and Technology Committee, as well as a more official sort of response in their early review last year, so the Science and Technology Committee released a report into the COVID pandemic in which they interview a number of players. They take evidence from various well-placed sources, as well as, you know, people like me, like we all fed into this process. And that again was sort of encouraging in terms of supporting some of the kinds of problems that we were concerned with. They particularly focused on what they called groupthink. You know, so they highlighted a comment by Dame Sally Davies, the former chief medical officer, where she says, quite simply, we were in groupthink. Our infectious disease experts did not really believe that SARS could get from Asia to us. It's a form of British exceptionalism. We need to open up and get some more challenge into our thinking. And they present a kind of critique of the presentation of, or the kind of, the presentation of the construction of consensus between official scientific advisors and government. And the report declares that, you know, the fact that the UK approach reflected a consensus between official scientific advisors and the government indicates a degree of groupthink that was present at the time, which meant we were not as open to approaches being taken elsewhere as we should have been. So again, my interest here is not in sort of picking into the particular details, the particular blow-by-blows, reconstructing the actual, you know, the blow-by-blows in the pandemic, but to say that here's an official report as well that's identifying this problem of identifying groupthink as a particular kind of problem or challenge, and saying we need structured challenge. So it seems to be pushing in the same direction, and it seems encouraging, shall we say, for like the kind of position that we were laying out. But my reflection on the Science and Technology Committee report, also on, I think, Michie's comments, and on the tenor of some of the other kind of discourse around expert advice, I would say, let me put it another way. If I were restating the argument that we made in the paper, I'd put yet more emphasis on the point about institutions. Because in a lot of these responses, the way the problem is being recognized, and they are recognizing problems of independence, problems of challenge, problems of being enabled to resist selective, deceptive interpretations and so on. But the solutions that are invoked center on ethos. They center on the kind of character and conduct of the individuals involved, and to sort of exhortations to those individuals to sort of do better in some sense. So, you know, in Mitchie's case, she uses the figure of telling truth to power, right, and invoking a kind of personal courage, standing up to others. In the Science and Technology Committee report, okay, they critique the inadequacy of groupthink, they call for greater diversity, and they call for structured challenge. They say that ministers were too deferential to scientific consensus. It was difficult to question it, but they should have done so. That seems to be the implication. And certainly, the evidence they take from people like Cummings and Matt Hancock, self-serving and exculpatory as it is, right, it presents a kind of heroic dissenter narrative, right? It's like, okay, I think I've got a quote from Dominic Cummings. It was clear. He said, but I was incredibly frightened. He said everything was wrong, bad, terrible, but I was incredibly frightened, I guess is the word, about the consequences of me kind of pulling a massive emergency string and saying, the official plan is wrong and it's going to kill everyone and you've got to change path, because what if I'm wrong? Matt Hancock, he says, I was in a situation, not having hard evidence that a global scientific consensus of decades was wrong, but having an instinct that it was. I bitterly regret that I did not overrule that scientific advice at the time, and so on, and so on, right? So yes, we've got these self-exculpatory narratives from these key players, but what they're feeding into and what the Science and Technology Committee report does not question is the kind of implicit heroic dissenter sort of framework. And in a sense, it's saying we've identified this problem, this need for structured challenge, and our solution is hope that these people have the courage of their convictions, or whatever it might be, to, you know, to draw on some reserves of ethos to resist this. And I think even in some of the more astute academic commentaries on reconstructing the dilemmas of expert advice and sort of making arguments for how experts ought to present their advice, I think fall in a little bit to this. I mean, just taking the most interesting one I've read recently, which was Jonathan Birch's paper, where he distinguishes between normatively light and normatively heavy advice, and makes the argument that giving normatively heavy advice, which is to say advice that comes with a clear, explicit, and sort of performatively vehement insistence, that doesn't take the form of saying, well, if you do A, we think B, if you do this, we think that, if you do this, we think that, do what you like, you're the politician. But essentially being like the marine biologist in Jaws and grabbing the mayor by the lapels and saying you have to close this beach. All right, in extremis, says, yeah. But this, again, I think it still fits into the sort of broad framework of sort of taking ethos as the route out of these kinds of challenges and tensions, by sort of leaving with the individual expert advisor the question how you judge, he uses the phrase, how you judge a situation to be sufficiently normatively terrible that it warrants this type of intervention, right? So I guess that focus on ethos seems to me to be still remarkably prevalent, and there's a relative sort of lack of questioning, or a lack of, to me, slightly surprising lack of critical discussion about the kind of structures, particularly in international comparison, where we have now increasingly like a view of radically different ways of organizing things and how we could perhaps organize these things differently. So I think the point we would bring out more is that we think institutions and institutional designs are a really important part of of enabling that kind of structured challenge, and of taking burdens off the kind of the individual the character and conduct of the individuals who are at these pinch points under phenomenal pressure and having to deal with all of these dilemmas. I mean, the point, and so Stephen John contacted me before this presentation, and he was curious to know what had changed in my views, you know, and as you can tell, in one sense, I sort of thought, I think we were right in a way. Or no, I still stand, or at least, let's say, I still stand by the bones of the argument about the importance of diversity and the importance of open disagreement in the production of expert advice. And in the background of that, I mean, was what that was in service of was a fairly conventional notion of what the place of expertise should be in politics, right? Which is, to use the sort of civil service boilerplate, advisors advise, ministers decide. Broadly, we want to have a separation between what we can understand about the facts of a situation, even given uncertainties and even given the ways that values can feed into the scientific process at quite deep levels. It still seems plausible that we want that. We want a sort of separation. And in a recent, well, no, not recent, forthcoming book, the political philosopher Lisa Herzog has put the point that we didn't quite make clearly about this, our attitude to this kind of separation of advice from expertise from political decision making. She put it better than we could, where she said, it's not a natural state that knowledge is separated from practical entanglements. It is, on the contrary, an outstanding social achievement, the result of careful institutional design accompanied by the right ethos, which can lead to more or less non-political knowledge creation. And why I like that way of putting it is that it puts the emphasis on the production of a situation. It's the outcome of institutions and ethos that can generate the situation in which experts can speak to their expertise freely and political decision makers can take responsibility for decisions. But to this point, what's changed? Well, one interesting reflection, one interesting analysis of COVID that I read was by Paul Kearney. Paul Kearney, a policy scientist. And one of the things that he emphasized, pushing back in a way on Susan Michie's sort of claim that we need to be free, we need to be independent, we need to be free to openly criticize. He emphasized that in actual fact, he says the chief scientific officer and the chief medical officer, in order to be listened to and taken seriously by ministers, need to be good team players. And a good team player doesn't contradict the captain in public. Ministers need to be able to trust their advisors. And they need to be able to trust their advisors not just to give them accurate assessments of the state of knowledge relevant to their decisions, but also to support them publicly, right? To serve to maintain their authority. And this can mean the suppression and the masking of disagreements. And this can mean making it unclear where expert advice is being followed and where it is not. So the kind of cases that Susan Michie is pointing to, where she wants to call out politicians for not following advice. Kearney's saying that's not understanding the constraints of these epistemic leaders, right? They're in this peculiar epistemic leadership role in which they are relating to political decision makers and have to build trust and build trustworthy partnerships in order then, one would hope, to deliver the kind of free and frank assessment of the alternatives and the kind of things that many people want them to do. But Kearney kind of presents, it's a description, right? He's not a normative theorist or anything. He's just saying this is the policy process. But he's presenting what is a kind of good chap model of expert advice, right? Which obviously depends on the presence of good chaps across the board, right? It comes under great pressure. It's very hard to be an expert as honest broker when you're dealing with a dishonest and corrupt interlocutor, right? But he's got this kind of good chap model. It's built on trust and teamwork. And that has made me sort of, not so much change, but it's made me more alert to a tension between the kind of premise of the approaches that broadly we could characterize as transparency, openness about disagreement. A tension between that premise of distrust, in a way, that's at work there, distrust and adversarial. It's a kind of, I'm not quite sure what to call it, but the adversarial, adversarial model, or the adversarial distrust sort of model, versus the good chap teamwork model, in which trust is central, right? And trust is sort of constitutive. And I suppose in one way this makes me think programmatically about our research, or my research on this, not everybody else's, but there's a huge amount, obviously, written about trust, particularly whether public trust political authorities, epistemic authorities. And that's obviously tremendously important. I wouldn't argue against that focus in any way at all. But I think it does blind us to some of the other trust relationships that might be at work in the production of expert advice. And I think this question of trust between experts and political leaders is a tremendously important and sort of understudied one, because there's a sort of prima facie divergence of interest that creates a kind of ground for a presumption that would point towards distrust, and yet a need to build relationships, and a need to build trustworthy relationships. And I suppose one of the things that's brought out to me, one of that reflection from Kearney, particularly the reflection on the importance of this, in actual fact, this kind of good chap model of expert advice, it might suggest a deeper tension between the idea of being open, about disagreements, and the importance of, or it suggests, or at least Kearney suggests, there's a trade-off. That there's a trade-off between openness about disagreement, about openness about the reasons and divergence, and the influence one has on decisions and the ways in which one shapes political decisions. And I guess so this is where I want to come back again. I still want to reiterate the point about institutions. So when we get to thinking about, to go to Stephen's question, what's changed and what's not, I'm still very much sort of team adversarial, right? I still think that finding ways to structure more, to openly structure expert disagreement can be tremendously important. I suppose what it's making me reflect more carefully on is the drawbacks of that and the trade-offs that sets up. Because it seems like it's not consistent with this kind of trust-based relationship, or it seems awkward. Perhaps it's difficult to square with that kind of trust-based relationship, and there may be a trade-off there. There are also questions of efficiency in decision-making that clearly speak to the sort of trust-based model. Like when you operate in the more adversarial distrust, it's more resource-intensive. It's harder work. Transparency is incredibly hard work. Somebody needs to produce those minutes and publish them. And it's more cumbersome. It's difficult. So that raises it raises for me in a sharper way, I guess, than I had realized, the sorts of tensions and trade-offs that might be at work between these broadly trust-based good chap approaches to expert advising and the more adversarial, distrust premised ones, in which we sort of seek to publicly announce disagreements in a way that would sort of force political leaders to take responsibility for decisions. So in a way, I guess the worry is that, you know, that initial sort of, and I think pretty widely shared thought that we want experts to advise and ministers to decide, under the sort of good chat model, it's blurred, and it might have to be, right? And so that I suppose is the sort of, that's I suppose the worry that I'm left with. So I'm gonna leave it there for those reflections on sort of trust and expert advice and adversariality. So thank you very much for your time.